Long before the first lightsaber was ever ignited, before Jedi and Sith clashed across the stars, before empires rose and fell, there were stories. In every corner of the galaxy, from the glittering towers of Coruscant to the quiet huts of farmers on distant moons, beings have gathered at night to whisper legends, to comfort children with tales of guardians who kept the darkness at bay, or to warn travelers with myths of shadows that dwell in forgotten ruins. These myths and legends are older than temples, older than fleets, older even than the Republic itself. They are the heartbeat of the galaxy, passed from one generation to the next, changing with each retelling but always carrying the same message, that light and dark, hope and despair, creation and destruction, all live side by side, intertwined like the twin suns of Tatooine sinking together into the horizon dot. In the Jedi Temple, younglings once sat in circles, listening as elders told them fables meant to teach balance. They learned of the Ashla and the Bogan, two eternal forces, one of light, one of shadow, who danced endlessly around each other, neither destroying nor surrendering. In these stories, the Force itself was alive, not something to be commanded, but something to be listened to, like a song carried by the wind. On far-flung outer rim worlds, where villagers feared raiders and the dark of night. Long before the first lightsaber was ever ignited, before Jedi and Sith clashed across the stars, before empires rose and fell, there were stories. In every corner of the galaxy, from the glittering towers of Coruscant to the quiet huts of farmers on distant moons, beings have gathered at night to whisper legends, to comfort children with tales of guardians who kept the darkness at bay, or to warn travelers with myths of shadows that dwell in forgotten ruins. These myths and legends are older than temples, older than fleets, older even than the Republic itself. They are the heartbeat of the galaxy, passed from one generation to the next, changing with each retelling but always carrying the same message, that light and dark, hope and despair, creation and destruction, all live side by side, intertwined like the twin suns of Tatooine sinking together into the horizon dot. In the Jedi Temple, younglings once sat in circles, listening as elders told them fables meant to teach balance. They learned of the Ashla and the Bogan, two eternal forces, one of light, one of shadow, who danced endlessly around each other, neither destroying nor surrendering. In these stories, the Force itself was alive, not something to be commanded, but something to be listened to, like a song carried by the wind. On far-flung outer rim worlds, where villagers feared raiders and the dark of night, parents told their children of wandering knights with glowing blades who appeared when all hope seemed lost. These tales gave comfort, even if no Jedi had ever truly set foot on those dusty streets. In cantinas thick with smoke and laughter, smugglers exaggerated the deeds of heroes and villains alike, turning battles into epics and commanders into demigods. Every myth, no matter how small, became part of the greater chorus of the galaxy's memory dot. And what makes these legends so powerful is not whether they are true, but what they mean. A farmer on Jakku might whisper of ancient Rakatan star gods because he longs to understand the ruins that dot his desert. A pilot in the rebellion might believe in the prophecy of a chosen one because it gives him strength to face impossible odds. Even Darth Vader himself became a legend in his own time, a name spoken not with knowledge, but with fear, described as a dark phantom who could kill with a gesture, a monster whose breath echoed in nightmares. Stories shape perception, and perception shapes destiny. In Star Wars, as in all of our lives, legends are not mere entertainment. They are the map by which people navigate the unknown dot to night comma. We wander into that map together. we will drift back to the dawn of the Force, where ancient beings wrote the first lines of history in the stars. We will listen to tales of Jedi and Sith as if they were gods and titans warring across time. We will hear of cursed forges that devoured suns, of swords that whispered with hunger, of dragons that slumbered beneath dunes. We will walk through the myths of Mandalore, where iron and fire forged both warriors and crowns. We will follow prophecies that foretold heroes born of no father, and we will see how even wars as recent as the Clone Wars have already grown into folklore. Their soldiers remembered less as men and more as symbols. In every age, the galaxy told stories, and in every story, we find a reflection of ourselves. The desire to resist despair, the hope that someone will rise, the quiet belief that light will always return. So, as you lie back and let your eyes grow heavy, imagine the stars of this galaxy spread wide above you. Imagine voices carrying across campfires, temple halls, and starship decks, each telling their own version of the same eternal song. Some of these myths are terrifying, filled with monsters of shadow and power beyond comprehension. Some are tender, filled with guardians who protect the innocent or wanderers who sacrifice for others. All of them, together, weave the great tapestry of Star Wars, a tapestry of memory, of legend, of myth. And tonight, we will let that tapestry carry us gently, slowly, into dreams. For the galaxy far, far away is not only history, it is story, and story is eternal. Before there were empires, before fleets crossed the stars, before even the Jedi carved their first temples, the galaxy spoke of beginnings wrapped in mystery, and those beginnings were told through the oldest myths of all, the dawn of the Force. Long ago, when stars were still young and planets had only begun to cool, there were whispers of the Whills, timeless beings said to have watched the birth of galaxies themselves, beings who did not fight wars or build cities, but who listened, observed, and recorded, inscribing the flow of time into an eternal journal. In the quiet of night, old storytellers in the Jedi Temple would speak of the Whills as keepers of memory, their words drifting like lullabies. All that is, all that was, and all that ever will be flows through the Whills. No one knew whether they were gods, spirits, or simply metaphors for the Force itself. Yet the legend endured, shaping the way generations thought of the universe, reminding them that nothing was ever truly lost, for everything became part of the song of the Force. From this mystery came the tale of the Prime Jedi, a figure spoken of in hushed tones and half-songs, said to be the very first to bring balance between the luminous and the shadow, the Ashla and the Bogan. The Prime Jedi, according to myth, was not a conqueror or a ruler, but a seeker, one who sat at the heart of the world Achto, gazing upon the seas, the cliffs, the stars, and the storms, and in every sound and silence felt the two sides of the Force speaking together. Where others saw conflict, the Prime Jedi saw harmony, light rising with darkness, strength balanced by compassion, creation braided with destruction, and from that vision came the first understanding that to walk with the Force was not to dominate, but to surrender, not to bend it to will, but to flow within it. In bedtime stories told to younglings, the Ashla was described as the warm sun, guiding growth, healing wounds, lifting hearts. The Bogan was described as the cool shadow, testing strength, forcing reflection, reminding beings that fear and anger could not be ignored, but must be faced. For children, the story of Ashla and Bogan was not one of good versus evil, but one of balance, a reminder that even the scariest of shadows had its place, just as night was needed to make day meaningful. On distant worlds, far from temples, Villagers shaped the same myth in their own words. Some spoke of twin gods chasing each other endlessly across the sky, one radiant, one cloaked in darkness. Others told of two great dragons coiled around the stars, their battle both endless and necessary. Always the theme was the same. The Force was both gentle and fierce, both life and death, both gift and trial. As centuries passed, those early myths became the foundation of everything that followed. The first wanderers who felt the Force stirring in their veins spoke of it as a tide pulling them, of whispers guiding their steps, of visions calling them to distant horizons. Some believed they were chosen by the Whills, others believed they were children of the Prime Jedi's line, but all agreed that the Force was not invention but discovery, something eternal that had always been and would always be. And so, before there were orders or codes, before there were lightsabers or councils, there was only the mystery, the feeling of the Force, as a living breath that tied together all things, the song beneath the stars that no being could ever truly silence. In telling these myths, the galaxy remembered not just where the Jedi and Sith began, but where all life began, in balance, in mystery, in the endless dawn of the Force itself. As the myths of the dawn of the Force spread across the galaxy, each world shaped them into forms it could understand, weaving the unseen current into poetry, song, and sacred story, and in doing so, they built a tapestry of legend that stretched farther than any star map. On the core worlds, philosophers wrote of the Force as an endless river, one that could not be stopped or drained, only followed. And they imagined the Whills as caretakers of its flow, mysterious scribes who dipped their quills into the current of time itself. In the outer rim, far from libraries and temples, nomadic tribes painted spirals of light and dark upon cave walls, telling children that these shapes represented Ashla and Bogan, siblings forever circling, forever chasing, never winning, never losing. In both refined verse and simple drawings, the same truth was whispered, that the Force was eternal, and that its balance was the secret of existence. The story of the Prime Jedi grew in richness with each retelling. Some said he sat upon Achto's cliffs for 1,000 years, meditating until stone itself grew around him, his form becoming part of the temple that still stands there. Others said he wandered the stars, carrying only his staff, teaching beings on distant worlds to listen to the silence between heartbeats, to feel the unity of all life. Many believed he wrote the first code of the Jedi, though it was not yet called a code, only a song of balance. There is light and there is shadow. There is growth and there is decay. In balance, there is truth. Children in the temple whispered this verse to one another at bedtime, as if it were a charm to keep nightmares away. But in some darker corners of the galaxy, stories twisted, for not all saw balance as harmony. On Moraband, where barren winds howled through canyons and shadows lingered longer than day, ancient storytellers claimed that Bogan was the truer path, that strength was found only in embracing the storm within. They spoke of Ashla as a deceiver, a comfort that lulled beings into weakness, while Bogan was the raw truth of existence, struggle, desire, the endless hunger that kept life moving. In this way, even at the dawn of myth, the seeds of division were planted, for while some sought peace in balance, others sought power in shadow. Yet even those darker tales still honored the Prime Jedi, for they could not deny his mastery. They described him as a figure of duality, with one eye glowing like a star and the other black as a singularity. a being who held both light and dark within without letting either consume him. To hear these stories was to feel awe, to believe that in the distant past there had once been someone who embodied all the contradictions of the Force and lived not as a god, but as a guide. And so the dawn of the Force was remembered not as a single event, but as a symphony of legends, each culture adding its own notes. The Wills as eternal keepers, Ashla and Bogan as twin dancers, the Prime Jedi as the first seeker of balance. These myths drifted across generations, shaping the way Jedi would meditate, the way Sith would hunger, the way ordinary beings would whisper when the night grew long. Whether true or not mattered less than what they gave: comfort in a vast galaxy, warning in times of darkness, and above all, the reminder that long before temples and wars, there was only the Force, infinite, eternal, waiting to be felt by those brave enough to listen. In the end, the dawn of the Force was remembered less as history and more as dream, a time when creation was still fresh and the galaxy's meaning had not yet hardened into laws or councils. The Wills remained whispers, neither proven nor disproven, but always present in the imagination of those who believed that every choice and every life was part of a vast story being written. The Ashla and the Bogan remained twin symbols, light and shadow forever circling, reminding even the youngest child that the world was not simple, that kindness and anger, hope and fear all lived side by side in the same heart. And the Prime Jedi remained a figure of mystery, remembered on Achto's ancient mosaics as a being seated in perfect balance, one hand lifted to the sky, one hand lowered to the earth, embodying harmony between the luminous and the dark. For Jedi younglings, these tales were soothing, teaching them that even fear could be faced, and even shadows had lessons to give. For those who walked darker paths, the same stories became warnings, temptations, or even excuses, proof that shadow was part of the natural order. But in every telling, across every world, the myths of the dawn carried the same refrain: that the Force was not born of temples or orders, not bound to one people or creed, but was life itself, eternal, infinite, and waiting for each being to discover in their own way. And so, when the galaxy looked back into its deepest memory, it did not find the names of kings or the victories of armies, but only stories whispered beneath the stars, stories of light and shadow twined together, stories of beginnings that never truly end. After the myths of the dawn came stories of those who first sought to live by the whispers of the Force, seekers who felt its pull so strongly that they abandoned their tribes, their cities, and sometimes even their families to follow visions across the stars. Many of these legends point to the planet Tython, said to be a world where the Force pulsed so strongly that every stone and every gust of wind carried its song. To walk upon its surface was to feel weight and clarity alike, for there the currents of light and shadow swirled in constant tension. In the earliest tales, pilgrims from across the galaxy were drawn to Tython without knowing why. Scholars, mystics, warriors, wanderers, each guided by dreams or voices they could not explain. They built no empire, no vast temples, only small settlements clustered around great stone spires, where they meditated and shared their visions. These pilgrims spoke different tongues, but the Force gave them a common language, and together they discovered the first truths of balance. Yet the stories say the planet itself tested them, for when one wandered too far into darkness, storms would rage, and when one denied their shadow too strongly, the ground would quake. Slowly, these seekers learned harmony, to draw from both light and dark without being consumed, to see that creation and destruction were both part of the same current. This early tradition became known not as Jedi, but as Jedi, an ancient order whose name carried the echo of both justice and wayfarer. They carried proto-sabers, primitive blades tethered to external power packs, glowing with unstable energy, symbols of both progress and imperfection. Their codes were simple compared to later Jedi teachings, less about detachment and more about balance. Neither deny the dark nor surrender to it, but walk the line between. Younglings in the temple would later hear bedtime fables of these Jedi, told as if they were heroes in an epic poem, wandering knights who faced trials of the spirit as much as trials of the body. Some stories tell of the great journey, when Jedi masters sent their apprentices out alone into Tython's wilds, where storms of Force energy lashed against the land. Those who returned were said to have found balance within themselves. Those who did not were remembered with reverence, their names etched into stone as lessons for future generations. Yet, even at this early dawn, there were divisions. Some Jedi began to believe the Bogan's power was too alluring to control, while others whispered that the Ashla's purity blinded them to truth. Slowly, inevitably, these disagreements grew sharper and the seeds of schism were sown. Still, for a time, the Jedi thrived, building temples across Tython that aligned with the stars, marking solstices and equinoxes, weaving cosmic rhythms into their daily meditations. They sang songs of balance, recorded their visions on crystal holocrons, and passed down teachings that spoke of the Force as a great ocean in which all beings swam. Whether these tales are history or myth hardly matters, for what they left behind were stories of the first order of seekers, imperfect but sincere, who tried to shape their lives around the eternal current. To later Jedi, these Jedi became almost mythical themselves, their legacy honored yet softened, told in candlelight to younglings who were reminded that even the greatest orders began as pilgrims who listened to the stars and followed whispers into the unknown. The Jedi of Tython, though remembered as legends draped in mystery, lived lives filled with rituals and trials that reflected their constant search for balance, and the stories of their practices became as enduring as their names. It is said that apprentices were sent to meditate at 9 great temples scattered across the world, each devoted to a different aspect of the Force, to light, to shadow, to knowledge, to power, to serenity, to healing, to strength, to anger, and to forgiveness. These pilgrimages were not simply journeys across mountains and deserts, but journeys into the soul, for each temple demanded a confrontation with one's own nature. At the Temple of Knowledge, apprentices faced illusions drawn from their fears of ignorance. At the Temple of Anger, they were tested to see whether they could feel rage without letting it consume them. At the Temple of Forgiveness, they were asked to release grudges so deeply held that they ached like old wounds. Those who walked the circle of temples and returned whole were honored as true Jedi Knights, not because they had mastered the Force, but because they had mastered themselves. Yet even these myths, told in soft voices to younglings long after the Jedi had faded, carried warnings, for not all who walked the path succeeded, and not all who succeeded walked in harmony forever. Some whispered that the temples themselves had voices, that the Force spoke through the wind and stone, guiding or deceiving those who dared listen. And it was said that the strongest visions were found at the Temple of Balance, at the heart of Tython. where the Ashla and Bogan swirled in visible storms of light and shadow. Many returned from that temple with eyes distant, haunted by visions of futures they could not change, and some never returned at all, swallowed by the storm. Over time, these trials hardened into rules, rules into doctrines, and doctrines into disagreements. For as more generations passed, the Jedi began to interpret their experiences differently. Some believed that the constant struggle between light and dark was dangerous and unsustainable, that the dark should not be embraced at all. Others argued the opposite, that denying the dark was arrogance, and that the shadow held truths the light refused to see. Small debates turned to bitter quarrels, and from those quarrels came the first great divisions, remembered in myth as the Dawn Schisms. These early conflicts were not yet wars, but they left scars upon Tython and upon the memory of the Order, and later Jedi would look back upon them as cautionary tales of what happens when balance is broken. Yet the Jedi were not only defined by conflict, for many legends tell of their harmony with the world around them. They crafted their homes from stone and crystal, carving great circular halls where voices echoed like songs, and they inscribed their knowledge into crystalline holocrons, each glowing with the light of memory. They spoke of the Force not as master or servant, but as companion, and they believed their own lives were threads in a greater weave. Their legends describe nights when they gathered beneath Tython's stars. Their voices joined in chants that resonated with the hum of the Force itself, creating an aura of calm so deep that wild beasts lay beside them without fear. They told their young that to walk with the Force was to walk in rhythm with the galaxy, that every breath, every heartbeat, every step on stone was a prayer. These images of wanderers under starlight, of seekers meditating through storms, of children hearing whispers from ancient temples, are the lasting echoes of the primeval orders. And though the Jedi would one day fracture and fade, their myths endured as the foundation upon which the Jedi and Sith both built their own truths. To hear these stories in the quiet of night is to remember that every order, every tradition begins not in perfection, but in searching, not in certainty, but in questions, and that even the greatest of legacies often grow first from fragile beginnings. In the twilight years of the Jedi, their myths began to blend into history, and what was once fluid and poetic hardened into the foundation for the orders that followed. Pilgrims still walked the circle of temples, but fewer returned, for divisions in belief grew sharper, and the storms of Tython grew wilder, as if the world itself felt the conflict within its guardians. Legends say that the final great gathering of the Jedi was held at the Temple of Balance, where masters and apprentices alike argued not with sabers, but with words about the future of their path. Some pleaded that they must cast aside the shadow entirely and devote themselves to Ashla alone, while others insisted that to deny the Bogan was to deny half the truth of existence. The debate lasted for days, turning into weeks, until the storm above the temple split the sky in two, one half filled with blinding light, the other with rolling darkness. To the Jedi, this was the Force itself answering, reminding them of what they had forgotten, that harmony is not found in dominance, but in balance. And yet, despite the sign, they could not agree. Slowly, quietly, the Jedi Order dissolved, their disciples scattering across the stars. Some would become the ancestors of the Jedi, who chose the path of restraint and light. Others would drift toward the Sith, embracing shadow as strength. Still others would remain nameless wanderers, carrying fragments of teachings into forgotten worlds where they became local legends and bedtime tales. Thus, the primeval orders faded into myth, but their presence lingered like a ghost in the Force, whispering through ruined temples, etched into crystal holocrons buried in stone, remembered in the mosaics of Ashla and the chants of younglings centuries later. To the galaxy that came after, the Jedi were both revered and revered for being the first to seek the mysteries of the Force, pitied for showing that even from the very beginning, division lay at the heart of destiny. And so their legacy became a reminder that the search for balance is not a task with an ending, but a journey that must be walked again and again. If the Jedi were remembered as seekers of balance, the Rakata were remembered as the opposite conquerors who twisted the Force into a tool of domination, a people whose very name became synonymous with hunger and ruin. Legends say that long before the Republic's first Senate convened, before Jedi or Sith raised temples across the galaxy, the Rakata ruled as gods of flesh and shadow. They were a species unlike any other, amphibian and predatory, towering with eyes that glowed with strange fire, their minds sharp and cruel. Their mastery of the Force channeled not into harmony, but into technology that bent stars to their will. This empire they forged was called the Infinite Empire, for they claimed no boundaries, no limits, and they sought to spread across the galaxy until no world remained untouched. The centerpiece of their myth was the Star Forge, a living factory suspended near a sun, said to feed upon its fire to craft endless fleets of warships and weapons, machines given birth not only by science but by the Force itself, darkened and corrupted by the Rakata's will. To their subjects, the Star Forge was a cursed forge, a blacksmith of shadows that devoured the very stars, a symbol that no matter how much was given, the Rakata would demand more. They enslaved countless worlds, stripping them of resources and life, binding entire populations in chains of flesh or in chains of spirit. For some stories claim the Rakata drained not only labor, but the very life energy of their slaves, feeding upon their vitality like parasites cloaked in armor. To resist them was to invite annihilation, and across the galaxy, myths arose of cities swallowed whole, forests burned until even the ash was stolen, oceans drained to fuel their war machines. Yet, as is the way with legends, the Rakata's hubris became their undoing. The same force that had empowered them slowly turned against them, or perhaps their corruption hollowed them from within. Myths tell of a great plague that swept through their kind, robbing them of their connection to the Force, leaving them weakened and vulnerable. Some said it was punishment from the Wills, others said it was the curse of the slaves who prayed for deliverance, their voices rising together until the Force itself answered. Whatever the truth, the Infinite Empire collapsed, its fleets abandoned, its forges falling silent, its people retreating into obscurity. But their ruins remained, scattered across the galaxy like scars. On Dantooine, ancient settlers whispered of Rakatan vaults buried beneath the soil. On Lehon, the ocean world once called the Infinite Empire's throne, strange machines still whispered in the depths, haunted by memories of creation and conquest. To the Jedi of later ages, the Rakata became a cautionary myth, proof of what happens when the Force is bent only toward domination, when hunger drowns balance. To smugglers and spacers, their name was a fireside tale, a reminder that even the greatest empires can crumble, leaving only empty ruins and warnings etched in stone. And yet, in the darker corners of the galaxy, others whispered in awe of the Rakata, seeing in their story not ruin, but power, dreaming of recovering their lost technology, of rekindling the Star Forge and wielding it once more. Thus, the Rakata endured not as a people, but as a legend of extremes, of ambition that consumed stars, of arrogance punished by fate, of a hunger so vast that it devoured itself. And so, as the galaxy passed into new eras, the Infinite Empire was remembered as both nightmare and lesson, a shadow at the dawn of history reminding all who followed that power without balance becomes a cage, and that no empire, no matter how infinite, can escape the judgment of time. Though the Infinite Empire crumbled long before the rise of the Republic, its memory lingered like a scar across the galaxy, etched into ruins and whispered through myths that frightened children and fascinated scholars alike. For the Rakata had left behind more than chains. They had left reminders that their hunger once stretched from horizon to horizon. Legends told of their slave worlds, each remembered not as places of life, but as graveyards of despair. On one planet, the Rakata forced entire populations to build towers that scraped the sky, only to abandon them when the people collapsed from exhaustion, leaving empty spires like fingers clawing for mercy. On another, they harvested oceans, siphoning water into colossal machines until only salt flats remained. And the descendants of those who survived spoke of a time when fish begged for rain in dreams. These myths describe the Rakata not only as conquerors, but as gods of famine, their appetites never filled, their laughter echoing over broken cities. And yet woven into the horror, there were always stories of resistance, sparks of hope carried in song. Some slaves, it was said, whispered together in the dark, singing to the Force with voices too quiet for their masters to hear. And in time, those songs became prayers so powerful that they reached beyond flesh, calling out to the living energy of the galaxy itself. The plague that struck the Rakata, stripping them of their connection to the Force, was believed by some to be the answer to those prayers, a silent rebellion carried by the universe itself. Where once they commanded fleets with a gesture, they awoke to silence, their power gone, their dominion crumbling like sand between their fingers. Worlds rose up in revolt, and the mighty empire that had consumed stars collapsed within a generation. Yet the fall of the Rakata did not bring peace, for their ruins remained, filled with weapons, machines, and mysteries. On countless planets, adventurers stumbled upon vaults humming with dormant energy, doors carved with strange glyphs, machines that whispered when touched, promising knowledge and power. To the Jedi, these ruins became dangerous relics, reminders of corruption that could seduce the unwise. To smugglers, they became treasure hunts, dangerous expeditions into half-buried temples. And to the Sith, they became objects of obsession, proof that the Force could be wielded not only to shape minds, but to forge galaxies into chains. Thus, the Rakata's legacy became a double-edged tale. To some, a warning of excess punished by fate. To others, a vision of what might be achieved if only the plague could be overcome. Across the Outer Rim, spacers told campfire stories of lost star maps, ancient navigational tools left by the Rakata, said to point the way to hidden treasure or forgotten forges of power. Some believed that if all the maps were joined, one could find the Star Forge itself, still circling its dying sun, still capable of spewing endless fleets for whoever dared claim it. These stories blurred truth and legend, yet they persisted, for the galaxy is always hungry for myths of lost empires and forbidden power. In the end, the Rakata endured not as rulers, but as warnings. They were remembered in the way shadows are remembered at dusk long, stretching, impossible to ignore, yet fading as night takes hold. And though their species dwindled, their name lived on as a whisper in the Force, a reminder that even in the earliest days of the galaxy, beings had sought to wield creation itself as a weapon, and that such hunger always devours itself. After the fall of the Rakata, when the Infinite Empire's ruins still smoldered beneath alien skies, new legends rose from the shadows of forgotten worlds, and among them none were as enduring or as haunting as the myths of the Sith. Long before the word Sith came to mean an order of Dark Lords, it was the name of a proud and ancient people, red-skinned beings who walked the valleys of Morabund and Korriban, worlds where the very air seemed heavy with mystery. They were a warrior species, steeped in ritual and blood oaths, their lives woven with sorcery, alchemy, and a belief that power was not given, but seized. To their children, they told tales of gods who slumbered beneath the sand, whose whispers carried in the wind, promising strength to any bold enough to reach for it. They believed that the Force was not a balance to be maintained, but a fire to be harnessed, a storm to be ridden, and from these beliefs came legends of sorcerers who carved their will into stone and bone alike. One of the earliest myths spoke of Ahuntapal, remembered not merely as a warrior, but as the first Dark Lord, a Jedi exile who turned from the light and sought dominion through shadow. Stories claim his tomb was cursed, that his spirit lingered eternally, bound to regret, a warning carved into the bones of history. Others told of Sith swords forged with alchemy, blades that pulsed with malevolence, said to drink the very life of those they struck, weapons not of metal alone but of hatred itself. Children of the Sith grew up with tales of their ancestors binding spirits into amulets, bending beasts to their will, calling storms of fire from the sky. To outsiders, these were monstrous fables. To the Sith, they were sacred heritage, proof that their power and their suffering alike tied them directly to the Force's darkest depths. The myths describe tombs that were not graves but gateways, where the dead did not rest but lingered, whispering to intruders, testing their courage, tempting them with promises of knowledge in exchange for loyalty. Jedi younglings who heard these tales in later centuries shivered at the thought of voices echoing through stone, urging them to pick up weapons they should never touch. Yet the Sith themselves cherished such legends, teaching that death was not an end but a transformation, that through passion and will one could become eternal. And so their stories blurred the line between history and nightmare, between ancestor and spectre. In every retelling, the Sith myths carried the same themes: strength through suffering, power through passion, immortality through defiance. To hear them at night was to feel the chill of old winds sweeping through forgotten tombs, to imagine glowing eyes staring out from the dark, to sense that somewhere in the galaxy the whispers of the old Sith still waited for those bold or foolish enough to listen. The Sith were not remembered only as a people of warriors, but as keepers of secrets so dark that even centuries later the galaxy whispered of them with awe and unease, for their myths painted them as sorcerers who could bend reality itself. They spoke of alchemy that turned beasts into monsters, swelling rancors into creatures of nightmare, and binding their rage into flesh, of rituals that trapped souls within talismans, amulets that pulsed faintly with the heartbeat of the dead, waiting to whisper to the one who wore them. The Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban was the stage for many of these legends, a canyon carved into the world's surface, its walls lined with tombs larger than palaces, each doorway said to hum faintly with the echoes of the dead. To Sith children, these tombs were holy, proof that their ancestors had not faded, for a Dark Lord's power was never buried but lingered, ready to test the living. To Jedi younglings, the same tales were taught as warnings, stories of travelers who entered the valley only to emerge raving, their minds broken by whispers that promised them kingdoms in exchange for loyalty. Among the most enduring myths was that of King Adas, remembered as the immortal God King of the Sith. In stories told around Sith hearths, Adas was described as a giant who reigned for 300 years, wielding a massive obsidian blade said to be infused with the will of the dark side itself. He was remembered as both savior and tyrant, uniting the Sith people against Rakatan invaders and seizing their technology, but also chaining his people in endless war, teaching them that conquest was survival. His death was told in different ways. Some say he was betrayed by those closest to him, others that he ascended beyond flesh into shadow. But always the legend ended with his people mourning a figure they believed would one day return when the galaxy called for him again. Then there were the myths of Sith sorceresses, women who wove spells of deception and desire, weaving illusions so strong that armies destroyed themselves in confusion. The most famous of these was the tale of Karnes Moor, who created the Moor Talisman, a relic that could twist ordinary beings into Rakuls, beasts of horror that spread like plague. Jedi historians wrote of it with fear, describing it as cursed, while Sith acolytes centuries later searched for it in secret, dreaming of the day they might wear it. Legends also told of great storms on Korriban, where lightning did not come from the clouds, but from the tombs themselves, summoned by the rage of the dead, and of nights when the stars seemed to dim above the valley, as if the sky itself recoiled from the power buried below. To those who lived in later ages, the old Sith myths served as mirrors of fear and temptation alike. To the Jedi, they were warnings carved into bedtime fable stories of how passion without discipline, ambition without balance, leads to ruin and madness. To the Sith themselves, the same tales were promises, proof that immortality and dominion lay waiting for those bold enough to seize them. And so the galaxy carried these myths forward, told in candlelit temples, whispered in smugglers' dens, carved into the walls of forgotten ruins, each retelling adding a new layer of dread and wonder, until the old Sith became less a people than a legend of shadows. An eternal reminder that the line between history and myth is as thin as the edge of a blade. As centuries passed, the Sith of flesh and blood faded, but the myths of their power only grew stronger, echoing through ruins, holocrons, and the memories of those who feared or desired what they once commanded. To the Jedi, these stories became bedtime warnings for younglings, whispered lessons told in the dormitories of the temple, reminding them that pride leads to downfall, that even the mightiest lords who bent the dark side to their will could not escape death or regret. Masters spoke of Ahun Napal not as a hero, but as a sorrowful shade, forever bound to his tomb because of choices he could not undo. They described the Valley of the Dark Lords as a place where shadows whispered lies so sweet they could unravel the mind of any who dared linger. Yet to the Sith, whether scattered in hidden cults or rising again in secret orders, the same stories were not warnings, but promises. They believed the Dark Lords had not vanished, but lingered, waiting to guide new disciples, their whispers more valuable than any holocron, their spirits proof that passion truly could transcend death. And so the myths endured on both sides, shaping belief, shaping fear, shaping destiny. For the Jedi, they were reminders of humility and caution. For the Sith, they were maps to power. And for the wider galaxy, they became folklore told in cantinas and marketplaces, often exaggerated, often misunderstood, yet always haunting, always fascinating. In this way, the old Sith myths never truly ended. They lived on not in stone alone, but in the hearts of those who remembered, and in the dreams of those who still listened for whispers in the dark. If the old Sith myths were whispered with dread, the Jedi carried their own stories told with reverence and awe. Tales meant not to frighten, but to inspire. Legends of guardians who stood against monsters and shadows so that others might sleep in peace. In the long nights of the Jedi Temple, younglings gathered in dormitories and listened as caretakers spoke of ancient knights who faced creatures so fierce that their very names echoed like thunder. One of the most enduring legends was of the Terentatek, a beast born from the touch of the dark side itself, said to thirst for the blood of Force users and to grow stronger in their presence. The story told how Jedi hunters, armed not with rage but with discipline, tracked the beasts into caves deep beneath worlds where sunlight never reached, confronting them in silence broken only by the hum of sabers and the roar of claws. In bedtime versions, the tale ended with a knight victorious, not through brute strength but through patience and cleverness, teaching children that even the fiercest shadow could be overcome by calm resolve. Another myth told of the Krayt Dragon, the great serpents of Tatooine, whose bones littered the sands like mountains fallen from the sky. To desert settlers, the dragons were nightmares, but to the Jedi, they became symbols of courage, for knights were said to have faced them not for glory, but to protect the helpless. One tale spoke of a Jedi who entered a dragon's lair unarmed, calming the beast with nothing but the Force, placing a gentle hand upon its scaled brow until its fury melted into stillness. This story, soothing as a lullaby, was meant to remind listeners that the Force itself could tame even the wildest storm, that violence was not always the answer. Then there were the tales of rancors, towering beasts of shadow and hunger. On worlds like Datomir, rancors were revered, bonded to riders through strange rites, but in Jedi lore they became the test of guardianship. A knight who could face such a creature without hatred, protecting the innocent without succumbing to fear, was said to be truly ready to bear the title of master. The bedtime version softened the rancor into a lesson that monsters are not always evil, only powerful, and that power must be respected rather than despised. Alongside these monsters, the Jedi preserved stories of relics and sacred places, such as the Valley of the Jedi on Ruusan, where thousands of souls were said to have merged into the Force, leaving behind a river of energy so strong that those who walked there could hear whispers of heroes long gone. In hushed tones, younglings were told that if they closed their eyes in the valley, they might hear voices encouraging them, guiding them, as if the galaxy itself wanted them to succeed. Another tale was of the Blade of Ruusan, a saber infused with the will of fallen Jedi, glowing brighter in the hands of those who fought selflessly. Though such objects may have been history or myth, their stories carried comfort, wrapping younglings in the belief that they were never truly alone, that countless generations stood behind them, ready to lend strength. These legends of heroes and monsters, told and retold across centuries, became more than fables. They became the foundation of Jedi identity. Proof that courage, patience, and compassion could overcome terror. And so, while the Sith haunted their children with whispers of endless hunger, the Jedi lulled theirs to sleep with stories of light, of guardians who stood between darkness and the innocent, of monsters tamed not only by blades, but by the quiet strength of the Force. In the end, these Jedi myths were not just about victory. They were about reassurance, teaching every youngling that no matter how vast the night, there would always be someone to stand with them, and that even in a galaxy filled with dragons, shadows, and storms, the light of the Force would never fade. Beyond the well-known tales of beasts and guardians, the Jedi carried quieter legends of courage that were told as parables, stories meant not to thrill with danger, but to soothe with wisdom. One such story spoke of a nameless Jedi who wandered the Outer Rim during an age of war, never seeking glory, never commanding troops, only traveling from village to village to protect the helpless. In one tale, the knight arrived at a settlement plagued by endless waves of raiders. Each time the bandits struck, the Jedi repelled them, but rather than destroy them in anger, he left them alive again and again. The children of the village asked why he did not simply end the threat, and he told them, "A monster may return if its hunger is not understood." Weeks later, one of the bandits approached the settlement alone, weary and broken, and confessed that the raids had been driven by desperation, their homeworld dying. The Jedi guided both villages together, teaching them to share resources until both communities thrived. The lesson was repeated in soft voices to younglings at night. Sometimes the greatest monster is hunger, and compassion can turn an enemy into an ally. Another bedtime tale told of Jedi who befriended beasts instead of slaying them. On Kashyyyk, it was said a knight once calmed a mad Wischock spider that had terrorized a village, guiding it back into the depths of the Shadowlands where it belonged, earning the gratitude of the Wookiees. On Naboo, an old tale spoke of a knight who rescued a wounded shark from hunters, tending to it until it grew strong enough to return to the wild. Children in the temple learned these stories to remind them that guardianship was not always about war, but about kindness to all living things. There were too legends of Jedi who gave themselves wholly to sacrifice, their names blurred into myth. One spoke of a knight who held a crumbling bridge with the Force long enough for an entire caravan of refugees to cross, their strength burning away until they became one with the current itself, their robes left fluttering like a banner of peace. Another told of a master who faced an army alone, not to fight, but to delay, speaking words of calm so powerful that the enemy faltered, buying time for innocence to escape. These stories lulled younglings into dreams where bravery was not rage but quiet endurance, where the true monster was despair and the true weapon was hope. In the temple's halls, these myths were often paired with the tales of monsters, the Great Dragon, the Rancor, the Terentatek to teach balance, that for every terror there was also a guardian, and that the galaxy, vast and frightening though it might be, was never without protectors. As centuries passed, some of these stories became so woven into Jedi culture that they were carved into murals, painted in soft strokes across the walls of libraries, or sung as chants during meditations. And though no one knew whether the nameless knights truly lived, it hardly mattered, for their myths gave shape to values more enduring than history To listen to them was to feel safe in the dark, to believe that no matter what shadows prowled the galaxy, there would always be someone perhaps unseen, perhaps forgotten, who would stand, and in standing keep the night at bay. In the end, the legends of Jedi heroes and monsters were less about battles and more about the values hidden within them, parables woven into the fabric of the Order and shared far beyond its temples. For younglings, these stories were lullabies that taught them to trust in patience, to see kindness as strength, and to remember that even the fiercest beasts had a place in the balance of the Force. For farmers on distant worlds, they were comfort carried by traveling storytellers who spoke of guardians who once tamed dragons and stilled storms, leaving ordinary people with the belief that even if they never saw a Jedi, one might be out there watching, unseen. And for the Jedi themselves, these legends were reminders of who they aspired to be, echoes of an ideal passed down from generation to generation. Some masters would sit with apprentices in candlelit chambers, retelling the same stories their teachers once gave them, each retelling slightly different, but always carrying the same heart. That monsters can be faced, that despair can be resisted, and that hope can endure. With time, the boundaries between history and myth blurred, and perhaps that was the point. For myths need not be literal to be true. They live in the way they are remembered, in the way they shape those who hear them, in the quiet strength they give to hearts afraid of the dark. And so the Jedi carried their legends forward, a light of comfort against the endless night of the galaxy, proof that even in a universe filled with monsters, guardians would always rise. If the Jedi filled their temples with quiet fables of guardians and balance, the Mandalorians carried their own myths, loud and fiery, sung not in meditation halls, but around campfires beneath iron skies, tales that turned warriors into legends and battles into sagas. At the heart of these stories was the Darksaber, a unique blade forged by Tara Vizsla, remembered as the first Mandalorian ever to be accepted into the Jedi Order. The Darksaber was unlike any weapon before it, a lightsaber with a blade as black as midnight, edged with white light, humming not with serenity but with a sharp, storm-like intensity. To the Jedi, it was a tool of its time, a weapon shaped by one who straddled two worlds. But to the Mandalorians, it became a crown, a symbol of leadership, proof that whoever held it was worthy to rule the clans. Around the fires, Mandalorian children were told how Tara Vizsla had united houses divided by endless feuds, leading them with both wisdom and strength, and how after his death, the Jedi kept the Darksaber in their temple until the descendants of House Vizsla stormed the halls to reclaim it, carrying it back to Mandalore as a torch of identity. From then on, the Darksaber was more than a weapon. It was myth in steel and crystal, its edge as much a story as a blade. Mandalorian songs spoke of crusades where armored warriors, cloaked in Beskar, descended upon worlds like storms, their war cries echoing across valleys, their banners snapping in winds of fire. These crusaders were remembered not as conquerors alone, but as seekers of glory, warriors who believed that only through struggle could one prove worth. To them, battle was prayer, and armor was scripture, every dent a story, every scar a verse. The myths told of leaders called Mandalaors, great chieftains who bore the Darksaber and commanded armies vast enough to challenge empires. In some stories, they fought the Jedi as equals, blades of plasma clashing with Beskar, that turned aside even the brightest strike. In others, they turned their fury upon one another, clan against clan, until Mandalore itself became scarred with the memory of civil wars. And yet, even in their fiercest legends, the Mandalorians spoke of honor of duels fought not for cruelty, but for claim, of warriors who bowed to strength when defeat was clear, of families who followed the victor not out of fear, but out of respect. Children were told that to walk the way was to never turn from a challenge, to face the galaxy without hesitation, to see in every horizon the chance to prove oneself. To outsiders, these myths painted Mandalorians as ruthless marauders, but within their own culture, they were songs of identity, stories that gave every child a sense of belonging. You are born of iron. You are tested by fire. You are Mandalorian. And so, whether sung in triumph or whispered in grief, the Mandalorian myths endured, their rhythm as steady as drums, their spirit as unyielding as Beskar, carrying forward the eternal belief that honor is found in struggle, and struggle is the song of life. The songs of Mandalore did not only praise their warriors, but immortalized their wars, retelling battles as if they were storms unleashed across the stars, each clash of Beskar and saber remembered as thunder and lightning. Among the most enduring were the crusades against the Jedi, retold around hearths and in hidden strongholds as epics where two titanic ways of life collided, the disciplined guardians of the Force against the unyielding clans of iron. Mandalorian myths describe Jedi not as enemies of hate, but as ultimate rivals, worthy adversaries whose defeat proved a warrior's greatness. Some tales spoke of the Battle of Shogun, where Mandalorian warriors leapt from orbiting ships in fire-forged armor, striking the surface like meteors, meeting Jedi Knights in duels that shook the very ground. In others, they told of the fabled siege of Sarush, where a single Mandalore stood against 3 Jedi Masters, his Beskar resisting their strikes long enough for his people to escape. These stories often ended not in triumph, but in sacrifice, yet the sacrifice itself was glorified, teaching children that honor did not always mean victory, but endurance, to stand tall even in the face of impossible odds. Still, Mandalorian myths were not only tales of war with outsiders, but stories of struggle within, for their greatest battles were often against themselves. The sagas of clan feuds painted skies over Mandalore with fire, describing rival houses clashing in endless cycles of pride and vengeance, each seeking to claim the dark saber, each certain they alone were worthy of its lightless blade. In these stories, the dark saber was not just a crown but a curse, binding their people to cycles of unity and division, a torch that burned as brightly in tragedy as in triumph. Some tales softened these truths for children, telling them that the blade itself whispered to those who held it, testing their worth, leaving them restless until they proved themselves in challenge. Others told of the silent wars, civil strife fought so bitterly that even Mandalore's fertile fields turned to glass under fire, leaving scars across the world's surface that could be seen from orbit. Scars that storytellers described as the very skin of Mandalore remembering its wounds. Yet even in these darkest tales, Mandalorian myths carried pride, reminding their listeners that Mandalorians did not fade quietly, they burned, and in burning, they left their mark upon the galaxy. In more tender moments, the songs spoke of family as the truest shield, of clans gathering together to eat and to sing after battle, of warriors forging bonds as unbreakable as Beskar. They told of children adopted into clans, taught the creed that blood was not the only bond, that to choose family was to be Mandalorian as surely as being born to it. These gentler stories balanced the fire of battle, reminding little ones that though Mandalore's song was fierce, it was also warm, carrying not only the rhythm of drums, but the comfort of voices joined in harmony. And so the Mandalorian myths lived on, not carved in stone like Jedi codes, but sung and shouted, reshaped in every generation, forever alive, a fire passed from voice to voice, a story that belonged not to history, but to the people themselves. As the Mandalorians passed deeper into history, their myths did not fade but grew more intricate, each generation adding verses to the endless song of iron and fire, each retelling shaping identity as much as memory. Central to these stories was always the dark saber, which became less a weapon than a living symbol, a torch of unity that also burned with the weight of division. Children were told how its hum was unlike any other lightsaber, its edge vibrating like a heartbeat, its glow pulling the eye as if night itself had been given form. For some, it was a crown whoever wielded it was destined to lead. For others, it was a curse of blade that demanded conflict, for only through combat could it change hands. Myths described it whispering in the dreams of warriors, urging them toward destiny, refusing to let the clans rest until someone proved strong enough to claim it. Around this center, countless smaller tales spun. Some sang of Mandalas, who held the blade high and led their people into ages of strength and unity, forging alliances so strong they rivaled empires. Others warned of leaders unworthy, who claimed it only to see their clans dissolve into infighting, as if the blade itself punished pretenders. Beyond the dark saber, Mandalorian myths celebrated Beskar, the sacred iron of their armor, forged in the heart of Mandalore's burning forges. In song, Beskar was described as the skin of the world, a gift from the planet itself, harder than any weapon, unyielding even to the strike of a Jedi's blade. Parents told their children that each piece of armor was a story, each dent a victory, each plate a verse in their song. And though Mandalorians were scattered across wars and exile, though their homeworld was scarred by their own conflicts, the myths of armor and family endured, reminding them that to be Mandalorian was not to live in one place, but to carry a creed wherever they roamed. Many stories softened these fierce truths for children, shaping even tragedy into lessons of pride. They spoke of how the fields of Mandalore once bloomed green before civil war turned them to glass, and then they told how Mandalorians adapted, thriving in the deserts, the cities, the void of space, proving that nothing could erase their spirit. They told of clans who adopted orphans from conquered worlds, raising them in the way, teaching them that choice was as sacred as blood, and that to speak the words, "This is the way," was to join a family stronger than steel. And so Mandalorian myths became not only chronicles of battles, but lullabies of belonging, fierce yet tender, ensuring that even in exile, their children knew who they were. In the end, the Mandalorians were remembered in the galaxy's wider imagination as warriors of fire. But within their own voices, they were remembered as singers of a song that never ended, a song of strength, struggle, honor, and family. Their myths endured like the darksaber itself, heavy, brilliant, dangerous, and eternal, a reminder that the legacy of Mandalore was not carved in stone, but alive in every voice that spoke it, in every heart that carried the rhythm of drums, in every vow whispered into Beskar that the way is endless, and through myth the Mandalorians would never fade. When the galaxy looked back upon the first great wars between Jedi and Sith, it did not remember them only as battles written in records or carved into stone. It remembered them as epics, cosmic struggles retold in myth, where light and shadow became gods and demons waging eternal war. The Great Hyperspace War, the first true clash of the two orders, was remembered less as a conflict of fleets and more as a storm that swept across the stars. Storytellers said the Sith Empire rose like a black tide, its lords cloaked in fire and shadow, its warships blotting out suns as they descended upon the Republic. To the people of that age, the Sith were not men and women, but sorcerers whose eyes burned like embers, who commanded spirits of the dead, who carried weapons that screamed when they struck. Against them stood the Jedi, remembered not as generals but as shining guardians, their sabers blazing like dawn in the endless night. The stories told of Naga Sadow, whose sorcery was said to split stars in half, summoning illusions so vast they seemed like entire fleets, confusing his enemies until reality itself blurred. He was remembered as both genius and tyrant, a sorcerer who believed he could bend the galaxy itself to his will. Yet, as the myths reminded listeners, the arrogance of one man cannot stand against the currents of destiny. The war turned, his illusions unraveled, and the Sith tide receded, leaving ruins scattered across systems that would never heal. To Jedi younglings, this story was told as a parable, that even the most brilliant deception is powerless against truth, and that darkness always consumes itself. Yet the myths of the Jedi-Sith wars did not end with victory and peace, for shadows always return. The tales of Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma became the next great epic, remembered like a tragedy sung by bards in low voices. Exar Kun was described as a figure of beauty and brilliance, a Jedi knight whose curiosity became hunger, whose hunger became pride, until he turned to the dark side in search of knowledge no one else dared to seek. He was remembered as the sorcerer who carved temples into Yavin 4, who bound the spirits of the Masashi to his will, who wielded a double-bladed saber like a storm given flesh. In contrast, Ulic Qel-Droma was remembered as the fallen hero, a man of honor who stepped too close to shadow, convinced he could master it only to become enslaved by it. Their friendship, once spoken of with admiration, became a story of betrayal. The two brothers in arms turned against one another, their conflict shattering worlds and staining the memory of the Jedi with grief. The myths of this war spoke of beasts unleashed, of Sith amulets glowing with cursed light, of Jedi masters falling in sorrow as their students turned upon them. Yet even this tragedy carried a thread of redemption, for Ulic, though broken and stripped of the Force, was remembered as one who, at the end, wept for what he had done, his tears becoming a lesson whispered to younglings that even those who fall may still find a spark of truth before the end. The legends of these wars did not paint the galaxy in simple colors of victory and defeat, but in shades of sacrifice, regret, and resilience. For every Sith Lord who rose in arrogance, there was a Jedi who answered in quiet strength. For every world scarred by fire, there were survivors who rebuilt. And for every story of shadow, there was another of light shining through. And so, across centuries, the Jedi-Sith wars were retold not as history alone, but as myth, a cosmic cycle of rise and fall, warning and promise, a reminder to all who listened that the struggle between light and dark was not only out among the stars, but within every heart that dared to choose. As centuries rolled on, the great wars between Jedi and Sith transformed from memory into legend, reshaped by the lips of those who told them, polished by the passing of time until they gleamed like ancient jewels, their details blurred, but their meaning sharpened. To the Republic's citizens, especially those who had never seen a lightsaber but lived in the shadow of war's scars, the stories became cautionary fables. Parents told children of Sith warlords like monsters from a fairy tale, beings who could command entire armies with a thought, who drained the life from stars, who turned friends against one another with whispers. The Jedi in these versions were painted as knights of impossible bravery, sweeping in at the last moment to cast down the shadow, their sabers glowing like dawn breaking after endless night. These were bedtime stories to give frightened hearts courage, not history to be memorized, but comfort to be carried. Yet inside the Jedi Temple, the same wars were remembered differently, not as triumphs, but as warnings. Masters spoke softly of Naga Sadow, Exar Kun, and Ulic Qel-Droma, not with the joy of victory, but with sorrow, reminding their students that all of these Sith had once been seekers of truth, curious, bold, and gifted, not unlike the younglings listening. The lesson was clear. Pride and hunger can twist even the brightest heart. These myths were not meant to lull Jedi children into dreams of glory, but to remind them that vigilance must begin within, that the first battle is always fought in the soul. And yet, among the Sith who survived in shadows, the same wars were told as epics of glory, with every defeat reframed as martyrdom and every fallen lord remembered as a titan of will. On Korriban, apprentices whispered in awe of Exar Kun, not as a tragedy, but as proof that one man could seize power that rivaled the stars. They spoke of Ulysses not as a broken figure, but as one betrayed, a victim of weakness, his story retold as a warning not to trust the light. Even Naga Sadow's illusions were reimagined as triumphs, celebrated as visions of a master whose reach extended across the galaxy. Where Jedi myths ended with humility, Sith myths ended with defiance, each tale teaching that passion and ambition were the true engines of destiny. And beyond these two orders, the galaxy at large shaped the wars into its own folklore. Smugglers told tavern stories of planets swallowed by fire, exaggerating until the Sith became gods of death and Jedi became avatars of light. Farmers on worlds touched by old battles warned their children not to wander into ruins, for fear the ghosts of the war still lingered, whispering promises to lure the unwary. Even centuries later, ruins of temples and battlefields were approached with reverence, half in fear and half in awe, because the myths had made them sacred in their own way. Thus, the Jedi-Sith wars became more than history. They became mirrors, reflecting whatever a culture most needed: courage, warning, pride, or mystery. And through each retelling, one truth endured. The struggle between light and dark was eternal, not only in armies and empires, but in the hearts of every being who listened to the story, lying awake under the stars. In the end, the great wars between Jedi and Sith were remembered less for the battles themselves than for the echoes they left behind. Entire generations grew up with these stories, shaping their view of the galaxy, some hearing them as songs of courage, others as grim warnings, and still others as calls to ambition. For the Jedi, They were woven into the lessons of humility, reminders that arrogance and pride could topple even the strongest knight, that no victory was without sorrow, and that the truest triumph came not from conquest but from restraint. For the Sith, they were immortalized as testaments to passion, each fallen lord seen as proof that strength could defy time itself, their tombs standing like monuments to will unbroken. And for the ordinary people scattered across countless worlds, they became campfire tales, stories to explain ruins that dotted their planets, or strange feelings in places where old battles had left scars on the land. The myths grew until the wars themselves became almost secondary, overshadowed by the lessons drawn from them. Whether told in the glow of the Jedi Temple's candles, whispered in the shadows of Sith tombs, or sung in cantinas filled with laughter and fear, the wars became part of the galaxy's eternal rhythm. They reminded all who heard them that the struggle between light and dark was not a chapter that closed, but a song that repeated, rising and falling like the tide. And so the Jedi Sith Wars passed into legend, not forgotten, not confined to history books, but alive in story, where they would continue to shape hearts and choices for as long as the stars themselves endured. Long after the first wars between Jedi and Sith had ended, when ruins still whispered with the ghosts of battles past, another kind of story began to take hold in the galaxy, not a tale of what had been, but of what was yet to come. These were the prophecies, fragments of visions recorded in cryptic words, carried across centuries like embers of destiny, and among them none was more enduring, more haunting than the prophecy of the Chosen One. Jedi children heard whispers of it before they could even hold a training saber. Masters spoke of it in hushed tones, in candlelit chambers, and even those who dismissed it entirely could not escape its presence. For it lingered like a shadow in the corners of history. The prophecy, in its most remembered form, was simple and stark. A chosen one shall come, born of no father, and through him shall ultimate balance in the Force be restored. That sentence, deceptively short, held within it an ocean of questions, and around those questions rose legends as vast and varied as the galaxy itself. Some Jedi told the prophecy as a bedtime tale of hope, assuring their younglings that no matter how dark the galaxy became, a figure would one day rise to set things right. They spoke of the Chosen One as a beacon, a shepherd who would lead the Force itself back into harmony, a guardian who would still the endless storm. These stories were often softened for children, painting the Chosen One as a kind and noble figure, a hero who would embody every virtue of the Jedi: wisdom, compassion, courage, and serenity. To hear such tales was to drift into dreams where monsters could be faced without fear, for one day the galaxy would have its destined protector. But not all retellings were so gentle. In some versions, the Chosen One was not savior but destroyer, a figure whose coming would be heralded by fire and death, whose path to balance would cut through ruin. In these darker tellings, the prophecy became less lullaby and more warning, whispered in the stillness of night to remind listeners that balance is not always peace, and that even the light can be reborn only after shadow has burned away. The Jedi archives preserved countless interpretations, each shaded by the fears and hopes of the age in which it was written. In the calm centuries, when peace reigned, the prophecy was recorded as allegory, a metaphor for the eternal work of the Order, proof that every Jedi, in their own way, could be a chosen one by choosing balance in their hearts. In darker centuries, when Sith returned and wars scarred the stars, the prophecy was treated with grave seriousness, studied as though its fulfillment were imminent. Its words weighed like precious ore in the search for meaning. And always there was the question, what did balance truly mean? To some, it meant the triumph of the light, the vanquishing of the dark so that the galaxy might live in peace. To others, it meant harmony, where light and shadow existed together without one overwhelming the other. A balance, not of victory, but of coexistence. The ambiguity of the prophecy gave it power, for it could be shaped to fit the fears or dreams of any who pondered it. Legends grew of figures across the ages who were believed, for a time, to be the chosen one. In some worlds, heroes who defeated great evils were celebrated as possible fulfillments. Their names sung in villages as if destiny itself had chosen them. On distant planets where Jedi seldom tread, ordinary people retold these rumors in their own words, transforming knights into demigods, their victories woven into bedtime stories of the prophesied savior. The galaxy, vast and uncertain, longed for such tales, for in them lay the promise that suffering and conflict were not endless, that history was not merely a cycle of wars repeating forever, but a path moving toward resolution. Even those who doubted the prophecy found themselves shaped by it, for doubt itself was part of its legacy, a reminder that even in an age of knowledge, some truths would always remain beyond grasp. Yet the Sith too twisted the prophecy into their own mythology. To them, the Chosen One was not a guardian, but a weapon, a figure who would one day embody the ultimate expression of power. In their tombs and hidden holocrons, they reimagined the Savior as a conqueror, one who would destroy the Jedi utterly and remake the galaxy in shadow. For every Jedi child soothed to sleep with tales of the Chosen One as a bringer of light, there was a Sith apprentice whispered to in the dark, told that destiny itself would one day crown the one who had the strength to seize it. Thus, the prophecy became not one myth, but many, fractured into countless mirrors, each reflecting the hopes and hungers of those who gazed into it. And always there were visions. Jedi seers, meditating in deep trance, sometimes glimpsed fragments, flashes of fire, shadows falling, a figure standing at the center of storm and silence. Some woke weeping, convinced they had seen the Savior. Others woke trembling, certain they had seen the Destroyer. These visions fueled the myth further, for each image became a story retold, each dream a fragment added to the endless mosaic. On Coruscant, some whispered that the Chosen One would rise from the heart of the Republic itself. On wild Outer Rim worlds, it was said the Chosen One would be born in obscurity, among farmers or slaves, rising from nothing to claim everything. In between, countless variations bloomed, and in each one the prophecy lived on, reshaping itself to the needs of the listener. But perhaps the greatest truth of the Chosen One prophecy lay not in whether it would ever be fulfilled, but in how it gave meaning to those who believed in it. For to believe was to carry hope, and to carry hope was to endure, even in the face of endless war. Jedi told the tale to remind themselves that their struggle had purpose, that even if they failed, the Force itself had set in motion a destiny greater than any one being. Parents told the tale to children, so they might sleep with the comfort of knowing a hero would one day rise. And even in the darkness, Sith clung to it as proof that their hunger was not in vain, that one day shadow would reign supreme. Thus the prophecy endured, century after century, not as a fixed truth, but as a song sung in countless voices, each voice reshaping its melody, but never silencing its dart. The Chosen One prophecy was the galaxy's dream, its prayer, its warning. It was the whisper carried across generations that history was moving toward something, that the endless cycle of light and dark would one day reach a moment of resolution. And though no one could say when or how or in whose hands destiny would unfold, the belief itself gave the prophecy power. For myths, after all, do not live by being proven, they live by being remembered, retold, and believed. And in the stillness of night, as younglings drifted into sleep beneath the glow of the temple's lights, or as farmers gazed at distant stars from their fields, the prophecy was there, lingering like a lullaby of the Force, promising that one day balance would come. Over time, the prophecy of the Chosen One became less a sentence carved in ancient texts and more a mirror into which the galaxy gazed, seeing whatever it most longed for. To some, it was hope, a promise that darkness would not endure forever. To others, it was warning, a reminder that balance might come only after fire. Jedi Masters debated its meaning endlessly, yet even in their doubt they repeated it, for its words carried the weight of destiny. Sith Lords twisted it into their own visions, dreaming of a champion who would sweep away the light. And ordinary people, far from temples and tombs, retold it in their own words, shaping it into lullabies or fables for restless nights. In this way, the Chosen One lived not only in prophecy, but in story, reshaped in every telling, eternal not because it was fulfilled, but because it was never forgotten. For myths do not require certainty to endure. They require only memory, and memory is the one thing the galaxy never loses. Thus, the prophecy of the Chosen One drifted through time like starlight, distant yet guiding, its meaning always just beyond reach, its promise always waiting like a whispered song of balance carried by the Force itself. The Clone Wars were lived in fire and grief, but they were remembered in song and story, carried forward as folklore almost as soon as the first battles ended. To the soldiers who fought in the endless campaigns, the war was duty and burden. To the politicians, it was necessity and tragedy. But to the people who watched from afar, who heard only fragments through rumor and tale, it became myth. Villagers in the Outer Rim spoke of the war as if it were a storm that swept across worlds, sudden and merciless, leaving behind scars that could never heal. For them, the Republic was not a Senate chamber on Coruscant, but the gleam of white-armored troopers marching in unison, their presence both protective and terrifying. In bedtime stories whispered to children, clones became figures larger than life, sometimes remembered as noble guardians born of the stars, sometimes as faceless shadows of war whose helmets hid more than just their faces. The Jedi, too, were transformed in memory, no longer merely generals of campaigns, but knightly figures cast in the mold of ancient heroes, riding at the front of armies like luminous champions. To hear these tales was to feel both wonder and fear, for the Clone Wars were not told as history, but as legend reshaped to explain the chaos of the galaxy on agricultural worlds. Farmers told stories of Jedi who appeared suddenly, defending villages from separatist raids, their sabers painting the night sky with strokes of green and blue. In these retellings, the Jedi became almost divine, their movements so graceful that children swore they must have been angels, their presence proof that even in the darkest of times, the Force still watched over the galaxy. Yet on other worlds, where memories were harsher, the stories turned grim. There, clones were spoken of as bringers of destruction, their precision strikes remembered not as liberation, but as devastation. Parents warned children not to stray too close to the cities, whispering that the white ghosts might return. These contrasting tales revealed the truth of folklore, that war is always remembered differently depending on which side of the fire you stand. The battles themselves became legends, retold like epic sagas. The defense of Camino was spoken of as a mythic storm where soldiers fought not only for their world, but for their very identity, standing against endless waves of droids as lightning lit the sea. The Battle of Umbara was remembered in hushed tones, described as a nightmare where friend and foe blurred in shadow, where loyalty itself seemed to shatter, teaching listeners that even heroes could falter when the night grew too deep. On worlds where battles raged in orbit, families remembered the skies turning into fire, streaks of red and blue burning overhead like falling stars, and they told their children that those stars were not weapons, but spirits. The galaxy itself weeping. Over time, these stories softened into parables. The war became not only about soldiers and leaders, but about lessons the futility of endless fighting, the courage of those who stood their ground, the sorrow of innocence caught in storms beyond their control. And then there were the clones themselves, whose very existence carried the weight of myth. Entire cultures remembered them not as men, but as symbols, beings crafted in secret who emerged fully formed, thousands upon thousands, as if conjured by some forgotten magic. To some, this made them guardians sent by the Republic's will, born without past so that they could devote themselves to the future. To others, it made them tragic figures, stripped of choice, bound by destiny, each face a mirror of the next, each life a verse in the same mournful song. Stories were told of clones who broke the mold, who showed individuality in small acts, a helmet painted with colors, a name chosen in defiance of numbers, a joke shared in the middle of battle. These small human touches became part of the folklore, reminders that even within uniformity, sparks of identity glowed. Children repeated their names like heroes: Rex, Cody, Fives, Echo, Wolfa, names that sounded more like mythic champions than soldiers, each remembered for acts of courage that blurred into legend as time passed. The Jedi's role in these stories was equally complex. Some remembered them as distant, too burdened by war to show compassion, generals who carried sabers like torches but spoke little to those they defended. Others painted them as saints who gave everything to shield the innocent, whose every duel with Sith or dark warriors echoed like thunder in the annals of time. Myths grew around figures like Anakin Skywalker, remembered as the boldest of champions, fearless and unyielding, leading charges that seemed impossible. On the other hand, whispers of his temper and recklessness colored these tales, turning him into a tragic hero in the making, a figure whose story carried as much warning as inspiration. Obi-Wan Kenobi was remembered as the negotiator, a calm presence amid the storm, a man whose patience became as legendary as his blade. To children who grew up with his name, he was not only a general, but a sage, proof that wisdom could endure even in fire. legends of Ahsoka Tano too began to spread. The young Padawan who fought alongside soldiers with courage beyond her years, remembered by civilians as proof that even the young could hold back darkness. Yet, the Clone Wars folklore was not only about heroes, but also about monsters. The droid armies of the Separatists became nightmarish in memory, endless legions of metal soldiers marching without fear, their voices droning like the hum of insects, their eyes glowing cold and empty. Children were warned in some cultures to behave, or else the tin soldiers would come marching for them. And looming above them all were figures like General Grievous, remembered in myth as a half-living terror, a monster of bone and machine whose 4 sabers whirled like storms. Count Dooku, too, was retold as a fallen noble, a man whose shadow stretched across the galaxy, his name spoken with both respect and fear, like a tragic villain from an ancient opera. In this way, the Clone Wars became not only an account of battles, but a gallery of archetypes, heroes, and monsters. Guardians and betrayers, each filling the role of myth within the galaxy's collective memory. And perhaps the most haunting transformation in folklore was the way the Clone Wars ended. The sudden betrayal of the clones, the fall of the Jedi, the rise of the Empire. These events were so shocking that they entered legend almost instantly, told in whispers as if the galaxy itself could not process what had happened. Some cultures remembered it as a curse, a punishment for the endless war, the Force itself turning against those who had waged it. Others told it as a story of tragedy, of brothers forced to turn on brothers, of knights cut down in betrayal as the fire they had fought to contain consumed them instead. For generations afterward, children were told that trust must always be tempered with caution, that even the closest allies can turn not from choice, but from the weight of destiny. The Jedi, once sung as heroes, became martyrs in these retellings, their downfall not proof of weakness, but of sacrifice. And the clones, who had been remembered as guardians, became figures of sorrow, trapped in the chains of a design they could never escape. The Clone Wars, then, were never simply history. They were transformed into story almost the moment they ended, reshaped in every retelling, serving as both warning and comfort depending on the voice that carried them. In cantinas, smugglers retold them as thrilling adventures, filled with duels and daring escapes. In temples, they were whispered as tragedies, reminders of pride and loss. In villages, they became lullabies, stories of guardians who once stood tall, even if they could not stand forever. And so the Clone Wars lived on, not in dusty archives or endless Senate records, but in the hearts and voices of the people, in the myths that soothed children to sleep, in the whispers that kept memory alive. In the centuries that followed, the Clone Wars drifted farther from memory and deeper into story until they became a tapestry of lessons more than a record of events. On some worlds, they were told as tragedies, reminders of how swiftly trust can shatter and how even the brightest guardians can fall. On others, they were sung as epics, filled with heroes whose names echoed like ancient champions, and in many places they were softened into parables for children, tales that made sense of a galaxy too vast and chaotic to grasp. To Jedi who survived in hiding, the wars became a wound remembered in silence, but even they could not stop their stories from spreading, reshaped again and again by those who needed them. The clones became both protectors and betrayers in memory, the Jedi both saints and martyrs, and the war itself both curse and lesson. In this way, the Clone Wars joined the great chorus of galactic myth, not confined to archives or history texts, but carried in song, rumor, and bedtime story. And though the galaxy moved on into new struggles, the wars endured in whispers, proof that even the most devastating conflicts can live on as story, reshaped until they comfort as much as they warn. When the Republic became the Empire, and the Jedi were scattered like ashes on the wind, the galaxy did not fall silent. Instead, it began to whisper, and in those whispers, seeds of rebellion took root. At first, they were small, a farmer hiding fugitives, a Freya pilot refusing to bow to an Imperial checkpoint, a child scribbling the sigil of a phoenix on a wall. But small sparks became stories, and stories became fire, until the rebellion was no longer just an army, but a legend carried from world to world. To those who lived through it, the rebellion was terror and uncertainty, fragile and desperate. But to those who remembered it afterward, it was the spark of hope, a myth of courage that grew brighter with every retelling dot. On frontier worlds, villagers told their children of nameless rebels who sabotaged Imperial outposts under the cover of night, slipping away before dawn with laughter in their throats. These figures became less like soldiers and more like trickster heroes, clever and elusive, proof that even the mightiest empire could be mocked and humbled. In city slums, whispers spread of women and men who painted symbols of resistance on Duracrete walls, daring stormtroopers to erase them, only for the symbols to reappear by morning. For those who saw the galaxy as an iron cage, these stories were lifelines, reminding them that freedom still lived somewhere beyond reach. And to children lying awake, the tales were lullabies, promising that one day heroes would rise, that the night would not last forever. Among the most enduring rebel myths were those surrounding the great battles that defined the movement. The destruction of the first Death Star, for instance, was retold across cantinas and marketplaces not as a tactical victory, but as a miracle. In these stories, the Death Star was remembered as a planet-devouring demon, a mechanical god of fire, and the single proton torpedo that ended it became the arrow of destiny, loosed by a hero, guided by the Force itself. Luke Skywalker's name became legend overnight, but even in places where his name was unknown, the story spread that a farm boy, nameless and small, struck down the greatest terror the galaxy had ever seen. To hear that tale was to believe that anyone, no matter how humble, might carry the power to change the stars. The Battle of Scarif was remembered differently, colored by tragedy. To many, it was a story of nameless heroes who gave everything to steal a chance for victory. Their names lost, but their sacrifice eternal. Folklore turned the rebels who fell on that beach into martyrs, figures who passed into legend not for who they were, but for what they gave. Children heard the story as a parable, that sometimes hope is not lit by those who live to see it, but by those who carry the flame knowing it will outlast them. In this way, the rebellion stories took on the shape of myths older than the Jedi, or Sith, the timeless tale of sacrifice for a greater future. The Empire, of course, sought to suppress these stories, branding rebels as terrorists, criminals, and cowards. Yet the very act of suppression gave the stories power. On core worlds, whispered tales of defiance carried the thrill of forbidden lore, retold in hushed voices, as if sharing them were an act of rebellion itself. On outer rim planets where Imperial control was weaker, the tales were sung openly in taverns, spreading faster than the Empire could silence them. And always, the stories grew in the telling. One rebel squad became 1,000. One act of sabotage became a legendary battle. One symbol scratched into a wall became a sign that entire systems were rising. Whether or not the details were true did not matter. What mattered was the feeling that the galaxy was not powerless, that even under the Empire's shadow, courage still burned. The rebels themselves became archetypes in the galaxy's folklore. There was the pilot, reckless and daring, whose starfighter danced among destroyers like a bird uncatchable. There was the spy, masked and shifting, who always seemed to know the Empire's next move. There was the soldier, weary but unbreakable, who fought not for glory but for the family waiting at home. And there was the leader, whose voice carried like thunder, who gave the hopeless something to believe in. Sometimes these archetypes aligned with real figures: Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, Alea Organa, Cassian Andor, Jyn Erso, Hera Syndulla. But often they blurred into myth, the truth swallowed by the need for symbols greater than flesh. Children in one sector might swear the rebellion was led by a warrior queen, while others believed it was guided by a nameless prophet of the Force. Both versions were true in the way myths are always true, not because they match history, but because they speak to the heart. And always at the heart of the folklore was the idea of hope. For in the galaxy's darkest age, hope was not simply a feeling, but a weapon. To tell stories of resistance was itself an act of defiance, proof that the Empire could not control every voice. Even in prisons, where chains bound hands and silence was demanded, prisoners carved rebel symbols into walls, whispering tales of the spark that would one day burn the Empire down. For them, the stories were not only about distant battles, but about survival, about enduring one more night because tomorrow might bring freedom. And so, through story, hope became contagious, spreading faster than fear, passed like a torch from voice to voice until the Empire's might seemed less eternal, its shadow less unbreakable. In time, these rebel tales wove themselves into the galaxy's larger mythos, joining the stories of Jedi and Sith, Mandalorians and Sith Lords. Yet they carried something unique. They were not only about the grand sweep of destiny, but about ordinary beings who chose to fight. A farmer who hid fugitives, a mechanic who sabotaged a walker, a child who painted a symbol. These were not figures touched by prophecy or trained in temples, but ordinary lives that mattered because they refused to bow. In that sense, the rebellion was not only an army, but a story. The galaxy told itself the story that no empire, no matter how vast, could silence the will of the people forever. And in that story, every listener could find themselves, for the spark of hope was not distant or unreachable. It was already inside them, waiting to be remembered. As the rebellion grew from scattered sparks into a blaze that could not be ignored, its stories multiplied like stars across the night sky, each one shining with its own light, each one feeding the next. The Battle of Hoth, though a desperate retreat, became myth almost instantly. On frozen worlds, people told of heroes who fought in blizzards so fierce the snow itself seemed to rise against them, of walkers that strode like iron giants through storms, and of rebels who held the line long enough for their people to escape. The retreat itself was remembered not as failure, but as courage. The courage to endure, to survive, to live and fight another day. In bedtime retellings, Hoth became a story not of loss, but of resilience, teaching children that even in defeat there can be strength, and that sometimes the bravest act is not to win but to keep going. Then came Endor, and with it, the shattering of the second Death Star. If the destruction of the first was remembered as a miracle, the second became a promise fulfilled. Stories spread of tiny forest dwellers, Ewoks, who toppled armored legions with nothing but courage and ingenuity, proving that even the smallest could shape the fate of empires. To some, Endor became a parable about unity, how beings of different worlds and ways could come together against a common darkness. To others, it was told as the final triumph of hope itself, the moment when the galaxy awoke to realize the Empire was not invincible. And though historians would later point to countless details and disputes, folklore stripped all of it down to a single radiant truth: that tyranny had fallen and freedom had won. But even after Endor, the stories did not stop. They grew, retold in marketplaces, cantinas, and campfires, reshaped by the tongues of those who carried them. In some regions, Leia Organa was remembered as a warrior queen, her courage shining brighter than any crown, her voice the spark that lit the galaxy. In others, Han Solo was celebrated as the trickster hero, the rogue who became legend by daring to laugh in the face of Empire. Luke Skywalker, too, became larger than life, remembered not just as a farm boy who destroyed a superweapon, but as a knight who faced down the Emperor himself and lived. Some versions painted him as almost mythical, a figure whose blade of light cut through shadow like dawn. Others softened him into something more relatable, the boy from nowhere who proved that greatness could come from the humblest beginnings. Each culture added its own verses. On desert worlds, rebels were remembered as wanderers of the sands who refused to kneel. On ocean worlds, their victories were sung as storms breaking ships of tyranny. On core worlds, the rebellion became a whispered legend told in drawing rooms, its details refined into noble parables of justice and sacrifice. And on the fringes among smugglers and nomads, the stories were wilder, filled with exaggerations and laughter, yet always carrying the same heartbeat: that ordinary beings had toppled the greatest empire the galaxy had ever seen. What made the folklore of the rebellion endure was not only the scale of its victories, but the intimacy of its acts. People told stories of the lone mechanic who sabotaged a generator, the nameless soldier who stood at a barricade, the pilot who gave their life in a battle no one else remembered. These small moments became part of the greater myth, proof that every act mattered, no matter how small. To tell these stories was to remind listeners that they too could be part of something larger. The rebellion was not only history, it was a mirror in which the galaxy saw itself flawed, frightened, yet capable of courage. And perhaps the most enduring truth of these tales was that they did not end with the fall of the Empire. For though the rebellion's battles faded into memory, the stories kept breathing, carried by generations who never saw the war but still felt its promise. Children born after Endor grew up playing at being rebels, painting stars on walls, shouting slogans of hope. Elders repeated the stories as lullabies, reminding the young that freedom was not given but won, and that hope must always be guarded. In this way, the rebellion became more than history. It became tradition, a living legend, as much a part of the galaxy as the stars themselves. If the rebellion gave the galaxy stories of hope, the Empire left it haunted by the legend of Darth Vader. His name was spoken not only as fact, but as myth, his black armor and breathing becoming symbols so powerful that they transcended history itself. To some, he was the Emperor's shadow, the enforcer whose presence turned courage to dust. To others, he was a figure larger than life, a monster or a god, depending on who told the story. Across thousands of worlds, tales of Vader spread like smoke, each one reshaping him until he was less a man than a dark myth that lingered long after his fall. Children in mining colonies were told to behave, or else the Black Knight would come, his saber burning red, his breath filling the air like the hiss of furnaces. In core world salons, he was remembered as the tragic champion of order, the one who had crushed chaos with unyielding discipline, his darkness reframed as the necessary price of peace. Among smugglers in cantinas, he was retold in wilder tones, a cyborg who could breathe fire, a figure who killed starships with a gesture, a being who could not die. The truth of Anakin Skywalker, the man behind the mask, was unknown to most. What endured was the mask itself, and in that mask, the galaxy saw what it feared and what it secretly desired. Power unrestrained, vengeance embodied, destiny shaped by will alone. The myths of Vader's duels became sagas in themselves. Farmers whispered of how he faced Jedi who returned from exile, their blue sabers flashing like lightning, only to be cut down by his relentless strength. Refugees described battles where he strode into armies of rebels, scattering them like leaves, blaster bolts dissolving against his armor as if the Force itself shielded him. Each retelling grew larger than life. In some, he was taller than any man, his saber able to cleave mountains. In others, his presence alone could kill, his shadow so heavy that it smothered life. Fear exaggerated him, but in exaggeration he became eternal. And yet woven into these tales of terror, there was always a current of tragedy. On some worlds, hushed voices spoke of Vader not as a monster, but as a fallen knight. They told of how once, long ago, he had been a hero, a Jedi whose name was lost, who fought for peace before the shadows claimed him. These stories softened his edges, turning him into a warning rather than a nightmare. Parents told their children that even the brightest star could fall into darkness, and so one must always guard against pride, anger, and fear. In this way, Vader's myth was not only fear, but lesson, shaping not only how he was remembered, but how the galaxy understood itself. Even after his death at Endor, when the truth of his final act remained hidden to all but a few. His legend did not fade. Instead, it grew. For when monsters die, they do not vanish from folklore, they transform. To Imperials who clung to the ruins of the Empire, Vader became a martyr, the strong hand betrayed by the weakness of others, his memory invoked as proof that only fear could hold the galaxy together. To the New Republic, he was remembered as the face of tyranny, proof that power without compassion destroys. And in secret corners, cults rose who worshipped him as a demigod of shadow, their chants echoing in ruined temples, their dreams filled with visions of black armor and burning sabers. The galaxy told stories of his mask, the way it seemed alive even in silence. Some claimed that to look upon it was to hear whispers, the voice of the man still lingering, his rage refusing to die. Others believed the mask carried power, that it could command the Force itself if claimed. In time, relic hunters pursued it not for history but for myth, convinced that in its dark gaze lay secrets beyond mortal grasp. Thus, Vader lived on, not in body, but in symbol, a myth that no fire could erase. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Vader's myth was how it blurred the line between man and machine. To children, he was remembered as the monster who had no heart, whose body was made of wires and metal, whose breath came from machines. To philosophers, he became a parable of what happens when one loses humanity to ambition, when flesh is sacrificed to will. And to Sith cultists, he became proof that man and machine could merge into something greater, something eternal. Each interpretation served its purpose, shaping the galaxy's understanding of fear, power, and destiny. And yet, buried beneath the layers of myth, there were whispers of something else, of redemption. A few rare voices told of how, at the end, the Black Knight had turned against his master, that the monster had found his heart once more. These were not official histories, nor were they widely believed, but they lingered, told in soft voices to children who asked if monsters could change. In those moments, Vader's myth shifted again, from nightmare to parable, proof that even in the darkest shadow, a spark of light can survive. For some, this made him less terrifying, for others more so, for it suggested that the monster had always been human, and that anyone might fall as he did. And so Vader's story endured, a dark myth woven into the galaxy's memory. He was hero and villain, monster and martyr, terror and tragedy. He was the nightmare whispered to keep children safe, the cautionary tale told to remind Jedi of pride, the symbol of strength invoked by warlords, the mask worshipped by cultists, the fallen knight mourned by dreamers. In his darkness, the galaxy found a mirror of its own fears, and in his final act, whether known or unknown, it found a glimmer of its own hope. Thus Darth Vader lived on, not as a man, but as a legend, a dark star in the galaxy's endless, mythic sky. If Darth Vader was remembered as the shadow that haunted an age, Luke Skywalker became the light that pierced it. His name spread across the galaxy like starlight, humble in origin yet vast in impact, retold so many times that the man himself seemed to dissolve into myth. To those who lived through the rebellion, Luke was a figure both extraordinary and ordinary, a farm boy from a forgotten desert who rose to strike down empires. But to those who came after, who never saw him or knew him, he was more than that. He was legend, the archetype of the hero who comes from nowhere to save everything. The story always began the same way, with the boy staring at twin suns. On Tatooine, this image became sacred, a vision painted on walls and etched into memory. Parents told their children that Luke once stood on the dunes at sunset, dreaming of adventure, his heart too large for the world he knew. The twin suns came to symbolize choice, the life behind him, and the destiny ahead. In this way, the desert itself became part of the legend, a place of silence, struggle, and waiting, the crucible from which the galaxy's greatest hero emerged. The destruction of the first Death Star was the moment Luke passed from man to myth. Across the galaxy, the story spread of how a young pilot, barely trained, had fired the shot that destroyed the Empire's ultimate weapon. In some versions, he was guided by ghosts of the Jedi, voices of light whispering through the Force. In others, he alone had the courage to trust his instincts when machines failed. Every retelling grew larger until Luke was no longer simply a pilot, but a vessel of destiny, chosen by the Force to strike a blow no one else could. In cantinas, the tale was told with bravado, the Death Star painted as a beast slain by a single arrow. In homes, it was softened into a bedtime story, proof that even the smallest voice could topple giants. The fact that he had been an ordinary farm boy was always emphasized, because in that ordinariness lay the power of the myth. If Luke could rise, so could anyone. Yet Luke's legend was not only about victory, but about the choices he made when confronted with darkness. The duel on Bespin became one of the galaxy's most haunting folk tales. In whispers, people spoke of how the young Jedi had faced Darth Vader, the Emperor's champion, only to be defeated and maimed. Yet even in defeat, his defiance endured. The tale of the fall from Cloud City grew into metaphor. Luke plunging into the abyss, yet refusing to give in, choosing death over surrender, his faith in his friends stronger than fear. For generations afterward, storytellers used this moment as a parable. That true courage is not in winning every battle, but in refusing to betray who you are, even when all seems lost. But it was on Endor that Luke Skywalker's myth crystallized into something eternal. To some, he was remembered as the warrior who faced both Vader and the Emperor, his saber flashing in the throne room's darkness. To others, he was remembered as the son who saw the humanity within the monster, who reached past armor and rage to the man hidden beneath. In folklore, Luke was described as the one who defeated the Emperor not through strength of arms, but through refusal to hate. He laid down his weapon, accepting death rather than surrendering to darkness. And in that surrender, he won. To the galaxy, this act became the heart of his legend, the hero who saved everything not by killing his enemy, but by redeeming him. In this way, Luke's story was not only about victory, but about compassion, and compassion became his true weapon in memory. That after the fall of the Empire, Luke's name became a banner carried across countless worlds. In the New Republic, he was celebrated as a savior, his deeds recited in ceremonies, his face painted on murals. Children played at being Luke Skywalker, waving sticks like sabers, shouting that they too could stand against darkness. But in quieter corners, his story was told with reverence. Pilgrims traveled to Tatooine, seeking the place where he had been raised, treating the desert as holy ground. Others sought his wisdom, convinced that anyone who had brought down both Sith and Empire must carry secrets worth hearing. In this way, Luke became both symbol and sage, his life reshaped until it resembled the old myths of the Jedi more than the man he truly was. And comma. As with all legends, exaggeration followed. Some stories claimed Luke could summon lightning from the skies, that he commanded the wind and the seas, that entire fleets bowed to his presence. Others said his saber was a relic of the gods, glowing with the power of suns. To the faithful, these tales were proof of his greatness. To skeptics, they were embellishments, but even they could not deny the power of the myth. For what mattered was not whether the stories were literally true, but what they represented, the belief that one person, through courage and compassion, could change the galaxy. Luke himself, in later years, became uncomfortable with the weight of this legend. He was only a man, yet the galaxy had turned him into something more, a figure of impossible expectations. But in myth, the human details often fade. The galaxy remembered not his doubts, not his struggles, but his moments of triumph. They remembered the boy staring at twin suns, the pilot who struck down the Death Star, the knight who faced Vader and survived, the son who redeemed a father, the Jedi who faced the Emperor without hatred. That was the Luke Skywalker who lived on in legend, not the man who questioned, who faltered, but the ideal who inspired. And so Luke's story joined the great chorus of galactic myths, standing alongside Mandalorian songs, Sith warnings, Jedi parables, and rebel folklore. He was remembered as both symbol and man, but above all as proof that light could rise from the humblest beginnings, and that even in the darkest night, hope could find its champion. For as long as the galaxy told stories, it would tell his, because Luke Skywalker was not only history, he was legend, and legends never die. As decades passed, Luke's name became a thread woven into every corner of the galaxy's tapestry, his legend evolving with each generation that spoke it aloud. In the core, he was remembered as the Jedi who restored balance to a galaxy teetering on the edge of ruin. His face painted in bold strokes on New Republic banners, his story taught in schools as the triumph of good over evil. On the rim, where stories often traveled faster than facts, Luke's image was reshaped into something more mysterious. A wandering knight who appeared when needed, clad in black, his saber glowing like a shard of dawn. Some tales said he could vanish into mist or call the stars themselves to answer his will. Others insisted he was not entirely mortal, but a figure sent by the Force to guide the galaxy only in its darkest hours. Pilgrims sought out the places he had walked: the homestead on Tatooine, the ruins of the Death Star's wreckage on Endor's moon, the forests where he once trained. Children carried small talismans shaped like sabers, believing they could call upon his courage in times of fear. Even those who had never seen him claimed to have felt his presence, retelling their own encounters with the legend as if his spirit lingered across the stars. Luke himself, ever reluctant to embrace the myth, understood that he had become something larger than life. But the galaxy needed its stories, and his had become one of the most enduring. In quiet retellings, his compassion overshadowed his victories. Parents told their children not about the battles he fought, but about how he laid down his weapon, choosing mercy when hatred would have been easier. That act, the refusal to kill his father, the decision to risk everything for love and hope, became the heart of his legend. It was said that he showed the galaxy that strength was not only measured in battle, but in the courage to forgive. And so his story was not just about rebellion and war, but about redemption, teaching listeners that no soul was beyond the reach of light. But legends are never simple, and Luke's became layered with contradiction. To some, he was a saint, untouchable and flawless, the greatest Jedi to ever live. To others, he was a man burdened by impossible expectations, his later struggles proof that even heroes could falter. Both versions held truth, for in myth, the human and the ideal are always entwined. What endured was not the details of every choice, but the vision he represented, that hope can rise from nowhere, that light can be found even in shadow, and that one life, no matter how humble, can alter the destiny of all. Thus, Luke Skywalker lived on not only in history, but in song, story, and prayer. To the galaxy, he was the boy beneath twin suns, the knight of compassion, the redeemer of a fallen father, the spark that rekindled the Jedi flame. And in that legend, the galaxy found comfort, for as long as his story was told, hope itself could never truly die. If Luke Skywalker became the galaxy's shining myth of compassion and destiny, then Leia Organa and Han Solo stood as its enduring symbols of resilience and defiance. Their names were not confined to the legends of Jedi and Sith, but bound up in the everyday struggles of people across the galaxy. They were remembered not only as heroes who toppled an empire, but as leaders, partners, and icons whose humanity made their stories as lasting as their triumphs. In the myths of the New Republic, they did not stand alone. They carried with them companions whose deeds became songs, whose courage became lessons, and whose presence wove the fabric of hope that stretched into the new age. Leia Organa's story was told first as that of a princess, born of royal lineage, but it was never her crown that defined her legend. Folklore remembered her as the princess who traded silk gowns for starship corridors, who endured imprisonment and torture but never broke, who stood against tyranny with words as sharp as sabers. To children across the galaxy, she was the warrior queen of the rebellion, her voice echoing through hidden channels as both command and comfort. In core worlds, her speeches were memorized and quoted like sacred verses, reminders that leadership was not the privilege of the powerful, but the responsibility of the brave. Among freedom fighters in the Outer Rim, Leia became a patron figure, proof that even in the shadow of empire, a single voice could rally armies. In time, she was remembered not only as general and leader, but as a mother to the new republic itself, guiding it through its fragile beginnings with the same fierce compassion she had shown in the darkest days of war. Han Solo, by contrast, was remembered in tones more colorful and unpredictable. To smugglers, gamblers, and outlaws, he was the trickster hero, the rogue who played cards with destiny and somehow always walked away alive. To soldiers of the rebellion, he was the reluctant champion who became indispensable, the man who turned away from selfishness to stand for something greater. His story was told as a lesson in transformation. The scoundrel who found a cause worth fighting for, the loner who discovered the strength of loyalty, the cynic who came to believe in hope. Folklore painted him as reckless, charming, and impossibly lucky, a figure who reminded listeners that even the most unlikely of people could shape the fate of the galaxy. His ship, the Millennium Falcon, became as legendary as its captain remembered as the fastest vessel in the stars, a ship that always seemed to arrive at just the right moment, a vessel of freedom itself. Children played with toys shaped like the Falcon, imagining it swooping in to rescue them from danger, while storytellers in cantinas described its hyperdrive failures with laughter and reverence, proof that even legends could be flawed. Together, Leia and Han became a story of contrast and union, the disciplined leader and the chaotic rogue, the princess and the smuggler, the fire and the storm. Their love, born in the crucible of war, became its own myth, told not only as romance, but as parable. For some, it was proof that even in times of endless struggle, there was room for tenderness and joy. For others, it was a lesson that true partnership is forged not in ease, but in challenge, in standing together even when the galaxy seems to fall apart. To the New Republic, they became not just heroes, but symbols of continuity, their presence a reminder that the fight for freedom did not end with Endor, but lived on in every decision they made. The New Republic's folklore also celebrated the companions who had fought beside them. Chewbacca, the towering Wookiee, whose loyalty became legend, was remembered as both fierce protector and gentle heart. Stories described him ripping apart stormtroopers with his strength, but also cradling wounded comrades with tenderness. To Wookiees, he became a cultural hero, proof that their people's bonds of honor and friendship reached beyond Kashyyyk into the very heart of galactic history. To children, he was the guardian who looked terrifying but offered safety, his roar remembered not as fearsome but as comforting. Thunder. Lando Calrissian, too, took his place in legend. Remembered first as the gambler who betrayed and then redeemed himself, he became a symbol of second chances, of how one's choices in the end define who they are. Folklore often exaggerated his charm, painting him as the man who could talk his way past fleets, but it also honored his bravery at Endor, where his leadership of the rebel fleet became the turning point of the war. For those who felt they had made mistakes in their lives, Lando's story offered solace. It is never too late to choose the right path. And sometimes redemption can change not only yourself, but the galaxy. Together, comma. These figures became the pantheon of the New Republic's mythology, not gods, not flawless heroes, but people whose humanity made them all the more inspiring. Leia, the voice that refused to be silenced. Han, the rogue who found his heart. Chewbacca, the loyal protector. Lando, the redeemed trickster. Their names were carved into monuments and sung in marketplaces, their deeds retold in every corner of the galaxy. And always their stories carried lessons. That leadership comes from courage, that love can flourish in struggle, that loyalty is the greatest strength, and that redemption is always possible. The people of the New Republic told these stories because they needed them. The fall of the Empire had not brought perfect peace. The galaxy remained fractured, scarred by decades of fear. But in remembering Leia, Han, and their companions, people found stability. They reminded themselves that if these heroes could endure, so could they. The myths became anchors, holding together a galaxy still healing. And over time, the heroes themselves became larger than their lives, part of the great mythic cycle that stretched from the Jedi of old to the rebels of New Dot. Thus, the tales of Leia, Han, and the heroes of the New Republic were not simply about victory. They were about endurance, love, loyalty, and hope. They were about the truth that even in the vastness of the galaxy, ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights. And in every retelling, the spark of their stories continued to light the stars, guiding the New Republic into the uncertain future with the comfort that legends were still alive among them. As the New Republic settled into fragile peace, the legends of Leia, Han, and their companions did not fade. They grew, reshaped by every world that spoke them. On Alderaanian refugee ships, Leia was remembered as the daughter who carried the soul of a lost world. Her strength proof that even a people without a planet could endure. On smuggler outposts, Han's name was invoked as both boast and blessing. Gamblers claimed his luck as their own. Pilots swore their ships had the heart of the Falcon if they managed to survive impossible odds. In Wookiee villages, songs of Chewbacca were sung like lullabies, his roars remembered as the music of loyalty. On industrial worlds scarred by the Empire, Lando's story was told as the gambler who bet everything and won, a parable of hope in places where fortune had always seemed cruel. These tales wove themselves into the fabric of ordinary life. Children wore toy blasters and called themselves Han. Others tied white cloth around their shoulders and marched as Princess Leia. Schools in the core taught about their leadership, but on the rim their names were spoken more casually, as if they were kin. Leia would not bow, parents said when teaching their children to stand tall. Han found a way became a proverb for impossible situations. Chewie never left his friends was a reminder of loyalty. Lando turned back was said to those who needed encouragement to change their lives. Their stories were no longer only about war. They were lessons woven into the language of the people. But myths also evolve in tension. For every voice that raised them as saints, others spoke with more complexity. Leia was admired, but also feared by some who saw her resolve as too sharp, her devotion to duty heavier than any crown. Han was celebrated for courage, yet in some corners he was remembered as reckless, a man whose luck had carried him farther than it should. Chewbacca was respected but whispered about as terrifying in battle. Lando was forgiven but never entirely trusted by those who remembered Bespin. These contradictions did not weaken their legends, they strengthened them. For in myth, perfection often fades, but humanity endures. In the grand halls of the New Republic, monuments were raised in their honor, shining tributes of stone and light. But in the hidden corners of the galaxy, their stories were carried more intimately in family dinners, in campfire tales, in lullabies sung to restless children. That was where their true legacy lived, not in marble statues, but in the way people remembered them as part of themselves. Leia's courage gave strength to the weary. Han's humor brought laughter into hardship. Chewie's loyalty reassured the lonely. Lando's redemption inspired those who thought their mistakes unforgivable, and together they embodied the truth that heroes are not born flawless, but made in the choices they carry again and again. Thus, Leia, Han, and the heroes of the New Republic became not only figures of the past, but living companions in story. The galaxy carried them forward, reshaping them into the guardians of its memory, proof that even after the fall of empires, hope could endure not because of crowns, or power, or prophecy, but because ordinary beings had chosen to fight, to endure, and to love. Beyond the well-charted lanes of hyperspace, past the beacons and navigational stars that bound the Republic together, there stretched a vastness the galaxy simply called the unknown regions. To navigators, it was a graveyard of false coordinates, riddled with black holes, shifting anomalies, and stellar storms that devoured ships without warning. To historians, it was a void filled with whispers, fragments of stories carried back by the few who had returned. And to ordinary beings, it was a place of wonder and dread, where myths thrived like stars unseen, each tale describing what might lie beyond the edge of knowledge. Some stories painted the unknown regions as a realm of monsters, a cosmic wilderness untouched by the laws of stars or the Force. Traders who disappeared into its depths were said to have been swallowed by beasts larger than moons, whose shells glistened like obsidian, whose tentacles could crush cruisers as though they were toys. In cantinas, smugglers told of ghost fleets armadas from forgotten wars drifting endlessly, their crews long dead, but their ships still patrolling on ancient programming. When the lights dimmed and the stories grew hushed, listeners swore they could almost hear the phantom signals of those ships, repeating messages from wars that ended centuries ago. These tales made the unknown regions not merely empty space, but a grave where the past itself lingered, restless and unquiet. Other myths spoke of civilizations hidden there, kingdoms and empires that rivaled the Republic but never touched its maps. Explorers returned with fragments of evidence, artifacts carved with runes no scholar could read, star charts that shifted as if alive, and reports of cities floating in nebulae that seemed to sing. Children were told of the Chiss ascendancy, though most had never seen a Chiss. Their name itself became legend, whispered as proof that not all peoples had chosen to join the Republic's order. In the unknown regions, some said, entire cultures thrived beyond sight, guided by forces or sciences unknown, their ships slipping through the void on paths invisible to all others. To the galaxy, these peoples became the hidden empires, the neighbors just beyond the veil. Imagined as both allies and threats, reminders that the galaxy was never truly complete. Religious sects and mystics carried their own tales, weaving the unknown regions into their visions of the Force. Some believed it to be the source of creation itself, the place where the first spark of life and energy had bloomed before spilling outward into the galaxy. Others insisted it was where the Force grew wild, untamed by Jedi or Sith, swirling in forms too vast for mortals to understand. Pilgrims whispered that wandering there was like walking through the dreams of the Force itself, and that to venture too far was to lose oneself in its visions, never to return. These stories cast the unknown regions not as emptiness, but as sacred mystery, a place where the veil between existence and eternity grew thin. And always, there were the darker legends. The Sith had long whispered of the unknown regions as a place where shadows gathered, where ancient lords had fled to escape destruction, their power preserved in hidden temples beyond the stars. Folklore claimed that when the Sith fell on Korriban, when their empires shattered, some survived by vanishing into the void. Out there, in the silence, they built citadels no Jedi could find, and in them they nurtured their vengeance, waiting for the day they would return. Whether true or not, the idea became a constant undercurrent of fear, that somewhere in the unknown regions, darkness still brooded, its eyes turned toward the galaxy that had forgotten it. Parents warned children that if they strayed too far, the sleeping Sith would awaken and claim them. Even among scholars, the thought lingered that the unknown regions might hold remnants of power older and darker than any known. For explorers who braved its depths, the unknown regions often became a canvas for imagination and exaggeration. A navigator who survived a near-fatal jump told of a star that pulsed like a heart, its rhythm so strong it shook the hull of his ship. A scout reported seeing entire worlds made of crystal, their surfaces glowing like lanterns in the void. Another swore she had glimpsed a fleet of ships flying in perfect silence, without engines or light, moving as though commanded by a single mind. Each story was doubted, dismissed by officials, yet carried forward in whispers because the unknown regions were a place where disbelief had no home. There, everything was possible, and the lack of maps meant that myth was the only guide. Even among common folk who had never left their homeworlds, the unknown regions carried power as story. Children dared one another to point their toy ships toward the black side of the stars where monsters waited. Lovers told each other that their souls would meet again in the unknown regions where eternity lived. Old pilots swore that the edge of the galaxy hummed with voices, warning travelers not to cross. And so the unknown regions became not just a place, but an idea, the embodiment of the galaxy's longing for mystery. The proof that no matter how much was known, there would always be something more. When the Empire rose, Palpatine himself was said to have taken interest in those uncharted spaces, and this only deepened the legends. Whispered stories spread of secret expeditions funded by the Emperor, fleets that vanished into the void and never returned. Some said he sought ancient power there. Others believed he was hiding allies too terrible to reveal. After his fall, the new Republic inherited only fragments of his maps, filled with cryptic notes and coordinates that led nowhere. This fueled speculation that Palpatine had found something or someone in the unknown regions, and that his secret still lingered there, waiting. These stories blended with older myths, creating a tapestry where the unknown regions were both treasure trove and threat, the place where the galaxy's greatest mysteries converged. In the end, the unknown regions endured not because of what was discovered there, but because of what was never found. It was the horizon that could not be crossed, the mystery that could never be solved, the frontier where myth lived stronger than fact. To the people of the galaxy, it was the reminder that no matter how far ships flew or how many stars were charted, there would always be a place beyond reach where imagination and fear could dwell together. And so the unknown regions remained, a vast silence, echoing with stories, each tale adding to the legend, each legend proving that some mysteries are meant never to end. In time, the unknown regions became less about the truth of what lay beyond and more about the stories people needed to tell. Merchants spoke of hidden trade routes guarded by spectral fleets, where fortune awaited only the bravest captains. Soldiers whispered of ancient armories buried in nameless worlds, filled with weapons too dangerous to unleash. On distant colonies, priests told their flocks that the unknown regions were the cradle of souls, that when life ended, spirits journeyed there to rest among uncharted stars. Every telling gave the void new meaning, new weight, until it became less a place than a canvas for the galaxy's deepest longings. And still, the myths did not agree. Some painted the unknown regions as a place of promised lands untamed, waiting to be discovered, filled with civilizations that might bring wisdom or friendship. Others insisted it was a domain of dread, where empires of darkness waited patiently, where the ghosts of the past still schemed for the galaxy's ruin. Scholars tried to reconcile these contradictions, but even they admitted that perhaps both were true. Perhaps the unknown regions were both cradle and tomb, promise and peril, the galaxy's reflection of its own duality. As centuries turned, these tales shaped behavior. Families told their children to respect the edge of the stars, to look with awe but not arrogance at the horizon. Explorers, in contrast, felt the pull of those same stories as challenge, hearing in every rumor of monsters or hidden empires the call to venture farther, to see for themselves what others only imagined. Many never returned, but those who did carried back new fragments of myth stories that were added to the tapestry and retold until fact and fiction were inseparable. And so the unknown regions remained eternal in the galaxy's imagination. It was the frontier that could never truly be conquered, the place where certainty ended and mystery began. To some, it was proof that the galaxy would never run out of wonder. To others, it was a reminder that danger always lurked beyond sight. But to all, it was legend, not a destination on a map, but a story that could be carried across generations, whispered by firelight or starlight, comforting in its constancy. For as long as beings gazed into the night sky and wondered what lay beyond, the unknown regions would endure, alive in myth, eternal in mystery. In the end, every myth, every legend, every tale told in cantinas or whispered in temples circled back to the same endless truth. The galaxy is not only stars and ships, not only war and empire, but a living song. The song is the Force, flowing through all things, binding together the smallest life and the grandest destiny. The Jedi called it harmony, the Sith called it power, ordinary people called it mystery. But whatever the name, It was always there, quiet yet eternal, like music carried on the wind. The stories of the old Republic, the rise and fall of Sith and Jedi, the courage of rebels, the tragedies of war, the wanderings of heroes, each was a verse in that song. Some verses sang of hope, others of sorrow. Some rose like drums of war, others drifted soft as lullabies. Together they formed a melody that never ended, echoing across centuries, always changing yet always the same. For every time darkness seemed to claim victory, light found a way to rise. And for every triumph of light, shadow waited at the edge, reminding all who listen that balance, not victory, is the truest refrain. In the quiet places of the galaxy, far from battles and politics, beings still told these stories. Parents recited them to children. Farmers spoke them while gazing at the stars. Wanderers carried them from world to world. They were not just entertainment or memory, they were anchors, helping the galaxy remember who it was. For in myth, people found the courage to endure, the wisdom to learn, and the comfort to dream. And though the names of heroes might fade, their stories lived on, carried like torches into new generations. Perhaps that is the Force's greatest gift. Not power to lift starships or hurl lightning, but the power of story, the way memory itself can bind the living and the dead, the past and the future. In the telling of tales, the Force is renewed, for every listener becomes part of the song. Every child who dreams of being a Jedi, every pilgrim who whispers of hidden empires, every rebel who dares to hope, all are voices added to the eternal choir. And so, the galaxy endures. Empires rise and fall. Heroes are born and pass into legend. Battles rage and fade into silence. Yet, the song continues. It drifts through the unknown regions, hums in the ruins of temples, glimmers in the laughter of children. It waits in the stillness between heartbeats, reminding all who pause to listen that they are not alone, that they are part of something vast, something timeless. The Force is eternal because the story is eternal. And as long as beings look up at the stars and wonder, as long as voices whisper myths in the dark, as long as hope finds a place in even the smallest heart, the song will go on. It has no end, no beginning. It is always here, waiting to be heard, waiting to be sung, the eternal song of the Force.